Hello everybody and welcome to the first video of Harloween 2020. I don't know why, but I was so nervous before recording this video, like way more nervous than I usually am before recording a video because it's the start of the Harloween season and this Harloween season is going to bring us even more mysteries, even more spooky true crime and history, even more tales that will leave the hair on the back of your neck standing straight up and have you looking under the bed before you turn the lights off at night. For you, I have prepared videos that will make you question whether or not you are actually afraid of the dark. These tales will come from all over the world and the time spectrum. They will leave you wondering if everything you think you know is true, and hopefully you'll leave each video learning something new that you hadn't known before. Our first video brings us to Salem, Massachusetts, a historical coastal city mainly shaped by its role in the witchcraft mania that swept the early colonies in the 1600s. It is known as the Witch City, a dark history that its modern-day inhabitants embrace fully. The witch trials are a dark and terrifying tale to tell, and we will touch on them in this video. But our main takeaway is one man who was put on trial for being a witch in Salem during the year 1692, Giles Corey, and the curse he left behind him on the city and its people who didn't protect him during the witch trials. Before we jump right in, let's have a word from the sponsor of this video, Truman's. Now, a somewhat sad reality about life is most of us don't have maids. We don't have people who come in and clean our homes. And at least a couple of times a week, if not more, we have to do the hard and dirty work of cleaning our own homes. But have you ever been in the store shopping for cleaning products and felt completely overwhelmed by all the different specialty cleaners, scents, fragrances, packaging? One plastic spray bottle for the windows, another plastic spray bottle for the bathroom sinks, another one for the toilet, another one for the floors, and they're all, like I said, usually packaged in one-use plastic bottles, which are going to get thrown away and just tossed into a landfill somewhere when you're finished with it. No one actually needs a ton of different specialized cleaning products that are usually made with harsh chemicals. It's so much more simple than that, or at least it could be with Truman's. Truman's offers non-toxic products that reduce shipping and plastic waste while effectively cleaning your clothes, dishes, and home surfaces. Truman's delivers these incredible, fairly priced products directly to your door, minus the single-use bottles, straight to your front door on your schedule. I'm kind of a germaphobe. You know that. If you've seen my videos before in the past, like vlogs I've done, I'm a little bit of a germaphobe, and I really like knowing things in my house are clean for me and my family, but I hate thinking about all the chemicals left behind after the cleaning process, especially with the dogs running around and little Bella who, she's 3, but she still wants to put her mouth on everything. And I also feel horrible when I throw the packaging away since I'm really trying hard to be conscious of the environmental impact of excess waste. Truman's offers the convenience that I love, having products shipped right to my door, not having to leave my house because I'm also a shut-in, along with the benefits of being waste-free. No more shipping products halfway across the country that are 98% water, no more single-use cleaning bottles, and best of all, they are toxin-free, meaning no more harmful ingredients getting flushed into our waterways or left behind in our homes. I've been using Truman's home care membership bundle, which includes laundry bars, dishwasher bars, and toilet bars for the last month, and I'm so happy with not only how easy they are to use, but with how clean they get my clothes, dishes, and toilets. The toilet bars are my favorite because I really always skeeve when I have to open the top of the toilet bowl cleaner, in the plastic bottle. Knowing how that actual part of the toilet bowl cleaner probably gets up into like the dirtiest and darkest places in the human world. With the toilet bars, I just drop one in, watch it fizz, and then do a quick scrub with the toilet brush. It's as easy as that. So easy and safe. My kids could do it, although they won't. They just won't. If you are interested in also elevating your cleaning game and making your home safe and the world a cleaner and better place, check out the description box where you can get 20% off all Truman's bundles by clicking the link. Thank you so much to Truman's for sponsoring this video, and thanks to all of you out there who understand this channel does need sponsors so I can keep bringing you content. Let's dive right into the video. Salem, Massachusetts is a well-known historical place in one of my favorite little towns to visit, especially if I'm in the mood for a nice walk through a cemetery, which I often am. Salem is also known as one of the most haunted places in Massachusetts due to the witchcraft hysteria that spread through it in 1692 and the terrible actions that followed. Now, Salem is located just 17 miles from the hustle and bustle of Boston, but it is a world apart. When it was incorporated in 1629, it started as a fishing town. The word Salem comes from the Hebrew word shalom, which means peace, and for a time it was a very peaceful place. But then the Puritans showed up. Originally, settlements began to form around the waterfront, and this area would become known as Salem Town, with the later communities forming on the outskirts being called Salem Village. Salem Town and Salem Village were distinctive from each other for many reasons. The residents of the town, by the water, were wealthy merchants who either made their money on imports and exports, or they were successful merchants and innkeepers. Salem Village came into existence when fields and woods inland were parceled out to families from Salem Town who were ready to settle down and start farms. These people inevitably became isolated from those in the town, and they became frustrated that they were required to travel 12 miles to attend church and perform other Salem duties such as the night's watch. Now, 12 miles doesn't seem like a lot to us in a time of cars, but in those days, there weren't cars. 12 miles could take you quite a long time to travel. The people of Salem Village felt that they were contributing a lot to the town, such as grain and produce, but they were getting very little in return since the town wouldn't allow them to build their own church. So, in 1666, some of the farmers of Salem Village petitioned for their independence from Salem Town. But they were told no. The town did not want to lose the valuable resources they were getting from the village, and they certainly did not want to have to trade with the town or pay for the grain and produce that the town was growing and farming. There was also a matter of religious disagreements. What else is new, right? Since the beginning of time, there's always been a matter of religious disagreements. Many who made their living as farmers felt the people in the town were moving away from God, becoming obsessed with money and material possessions. This divide had become even worse in 1662 when the congregational churches of New England allowed something called the Halfway Covenant. Church membership had been steadily dropping for years, and the reason for that being it was pretty difficult and invasive to become a full-fledged member of a church at this time. You would be expected to stand in front of the entire congregation and confess all the sins of your life, as well as share your personal conversion experience. And this could sometimes take years of soul searching and conversations with God. It was strict, it was uncomfortable and awkward, embarrassing even, and as a result, congregations began to dwindle. Historian Perry Miller once wrote that the Puritans liberated men from the treadmill of indulgences and penance, but cast them into the iron couch of introspection. With the halfway covenant introduced, those who did not want to jump through all of these hoops to be a part of a church could confess their sins privately to their minister as long as they had been baptized and were attending church regularly, and then they would be considered members of the church because of the halfway covenant. So the more modern people living in Salem Town took advantage of this, but those who still held onto the traditional puritanical beliefs, mostly in the village, they were outraged and they viewed the covenant as more half-assed than anything. It went against what they had traveled so far to achieve and had taken so long to achieve. And many churches around the state refused to accept halfway covenant members. And that brings us to a family rivalry that, in my opinion, pretty much sparked the flame of the witch trials. Everything really stems from two of the most influential and wealthy families in Salem Village, the Putnams and the Porters, who were at odds with their relationship with Salem town. The Porters were the richest family in the area. They were in possession of 2,000 acres of land between the three Porter brothers, Joseph, Benjamin, and Israel. The Porters were financially in bed with Salem town since they owned 3 of the 4 sawmills in Salem, and they made quite a lot of money from providing the ever-growing Salem town with lumber for building. Even though they were living in the village, not the town, they were in support of the halfway covenant and in support of continuing the relationship as it was with Salem Village and Salem town. But the second richest family in Salem Village, the Putnams, felt exactly opposite in every single way. The Putnams were made up of John Putnam and his 3 sons, Thomas, Nathaniel, and John Jr. The Putnams had no deal, no connection with the town of Salem. They weren't making money by still being tied to them like the Porters were. And they hated the halfway covenant. They saw it as a sign that the church was becoming less strict and its people were becoming further away from God. Now, the Putnams, they owned and controlled 800 acres of land, and they did not feel like paying taxes to Salem town when there was no benefit to them financially or otherwise, and when those bougie people in the town were clearly straying from the word of God. So in 1670, Salem town voted to build a new meeting house in the town, which in that time would act as not only, a place for the community to gather, but as well as a place for the community to worship. And they wanted money from the farmers in the village to help pay for it, to help build it. But many, including the Putnams, refused. They were like, no, we're not giving you any more money. They went to Boston to petition the courts, and they were sent back to Salem after being told, work it out amongst yourselves. This is not something that's super important and on our list of things to do today, so go back and work it out amongst yourselves. Something which took 2 long years to accomplish. Finally, in 1672, Salem Village was given permission to build their own meeting house and bring in their own minister. Now, they would still have to defer to Salem town for their legal matters, but it was a small win for Salem Village. The community of Salem Village would no longer have to travel all the way to the town to worship, and they would have some control over their religious choices. Now, to make matters worse between the two families, the Putnams and the Porters, Thomas Putnam died in 1686, and it was assumed his fortune and his land would be divided up equally amongst his 9 children from 2 separate marriages. Now, imagine everyone's surprise, however, when they found out that Thomas had left everything to his second wife, Mary, the mother of only one of his children, the then 16-year-old Joseph Putnam. Now, why is this relevant? Well, Mary Putnam was the daughter of another powerful man, Israel Porter, and the granddaughter of another powerful man, William Hawthorne from Salem town. And remember, the Putnams and the Porters hate each other. So as a result, much of the Putnam fortune ended up with their arch enemies, the Porters, which obviously deepened the tension and resentment between the two families. Enter the Reverend Samuel Parris, who would be the minister at Salem Village during the time of the witch trials. He was a complicated man, to say the least, and his arrival in Salem did more to foster the deep-seated rivalry of the Putnams and the Porters. Samuel Parris's uncle, John Parris, had gotten involved in the African slave trade in Barbados pretty early on, and he lived there on a plantation. But when he died, he left everything to his brother, Samuel Parris's father, Thomas Parris, who moved his whole family, including Samuel, to Barbados in order to run the business when Samuel was 7. Now, Samuel decided to go to Harvard in Boston for college instead of going to England for college because as a Puritan, it was the more conservative option, and he was there in 1673 when his father died. So he was compelled to drop out of school and move back to Barbados to take over his father's estate and become a sugar merchant. But 2 years later, the sugar market crashed after a hurricane destroyed most of the island, and this was followed by a smallpox outbreak in 1680. It was bad, He had to admit defeat, sell everything, and return to Boston with the family slaves Tituba and John Indian. In Boston, Samuel reconnected with his college friends who were a part of the Puritan movement. He got married, had 3 children, and he tried to make a living as a merchant, but eventually started training alongside his uncle at the Boston Puritan Church. That is where he was when he met a man who told him about a family who was looking for a minister for their town. That family was the Putnams, and that town was Salem. Now, Samuel wasn't ordained yet, but he obviously thought he was up for the job. So in 1689, he traveled to the village of Salem, and he was ordained by the community, who were happy to have a good Puritan man in their midst who would scare the crap out of the people with the appropriate amounts of threats of hellfire and brimstone. Now remember, this is the village of Salem. They've just been granted the ability to have their own church and have their own minister, and Samuel Parris is their choice. But he was actually at the end of a very long line of ministers that did not work out, but that is a story for another day. So once he gets to Salem Village, he begins to cause some trouble amongst the already troubled citizens. He was not a believer in the halfway covenant, and he refused church membership to anyone who practiced it, even denying them communion, thus making himself an enemy of the very powerful porters. In turn, the porters, who were on the Salem Tax Committee, refused to pay Samuel Parris's salary. They wouldn't even give him the firewood that he needed to keep his house warm in the freezing New England winters. Samuel Parris considered himself to be a very God-fearing, pious man, so it's not a huge surprise to find that when his daughter and his niece both came down with an ailment that could not be explained away by doctors, he would turn to an otherworldly source. In the winter of 1692, Samuel Parris was living with his wife and 3 children. He had also taken in his sister's 12-year-old daughter, Abigail, after her parents were killed by Native Americans during a raid, and she had become an orphan. It seems like Abigail and Samuel's daughter, Elizabeth Parris, or Betty, were experimenting with the Venus glass technique, which was supposedly a way you could tell the future and find out who your husband would be, and the girls became terrified when they saw the shape of a coffin in the glass. Not long after this, Abigail began having fits. She would writhe and twist, screaming that some unseen force was tormenting her before collapsing on the floor. And not long after this, Samuel's 9-year-old daughter, Betty, began displaying the same exact symptoms. Samuel didn't know what to do, but he was afraid. This wasn't the first time he'd seen something like this. A few years prior, in 1688, when he was living in Boston, Samuel had been called to the house of the Goodwins, and their 4 children had begun showing the same symptoms: writhing, screaming about invisible hands torturing them, almost having seizures before collapsing, exhausted. During their fits, these 4 girls began to cry out that they were being attacked by their neighbor, Goody Glover, an elderly woman who had come to the colonies from Ireland. Goody Glover, whose real name was Anne Glover, and her daughter were both working as housekeepers in the home of John Goodwin, until John's 13-year-old daughter, Martha, accused Anne of stealing laundry. Anne defended herself and told the young girl that she had done no such thing, which evidently led to an argument that ended with Anne Glover cursing Martha. After this, the girls all became ill, and the doctor who saw them told their parents it must be witchcraft, since he had no other logical explanation. Goody Glover was arrested, charged with witchcraft, and hanged on November 16th, 1688. and she actually became the last person to be hanged in Boston as a witch, even though the Salem witch trials would happen some years later. Cotton Mather, a well-known New England Puritan minister and author, had written extensively about Goody Glover, her trial, and her execution. Samuel Parris racked his brain to think of a similar situation in Salem where his household may have been similarly cursed, and he remembered a time not long ago where a woman named Sarah Good, a woman who had been reduced to poverty after her first husband died, leaving her with his debts, a woman who was well known for knocking on doors and asking for money, had come to his home with her small child. When Sarah Good and her child were turned away without a cent, she was heard muttering something under her breath, which obviously must have been a curse. She couldn't have just been complaining. It must have been a curse. Now, the Parris family physician, William Griggs, was finally called to examine the girls after almost a month had gone by with no improvement, and he claimed that he discovered no physical ailment that would be causing their symptoms. He thought that there must be something evil at hand. And then he just left. He left the house and the family to just think about that. I can't really tell you what's going on with your daughters, but I'm sure it's something evil. On February 25th, 1692, Samuel Parris and his wife Elizabeth went to the church to pray on the girls' conditions, leaving the girls with Tituba, her husband John Indian, and a neighbor and member of their congregation, Mary Sibley. Mary was a mother of 5, with one more on the way. So when she saw these two girls suffering, she felt compelled to help in any way she could, as any mother would, which is when she remembered an old remedy she'd heard about while she'd been living in England. She instructed John Indian to collect urine from Abigail and Betty. She then baked the urine with flour and made these biscuits, which were then fed to the family dog. Now, I don't really know what she was trying to do here. I think the point of the whole thing was to try and pass the ailment from the girls to the dog, which is like, poor dog, why does the dog deserve that? But it seemed to only make their symptoms worse. Their convulsions increased, and they began to yell that they were seeing the dark shape of a person who was attacking them. When Samuel and Elizabeth arrived back home after praying at church for them to get better and noticed how much worse the girls were, they were obviously freaked out, and they asked the girls, "Who's hurting you? Tell us, who's hurting you?" Both girls claimed it was Tituba, the family slave who Samuel Parris had known all of his life since he was a kid. They said the specter of Tituba was slapping them and pinching them while she laughed with glee. Obviously, Samuel Parris went to Tituba with these accusations, and she promptly threw Mary Sibley under the bus, telling Samuel what Mary had done with the urine and the biscuits, and he was livid. He could not believe that a member of his own congregation, which, remember, didn't even take part or have anything to do with the halfway covenant, so Mary Sibley was a full member of the church. He couldn't believe that she would practice black magic under his own roof with his own family members. He felt that Mary had called upon the powers of the devil to heal the girls, and as a result, she had invited the Dark Lord into his home and their community. Word began to spread around town very quickly after that. Samuel had called in a few other ministers to inspect the girls, and these men went home telling their family, friends, and neighbors that there was a witch amongst them. The story spread like wildfire, bringing fear and suspicion to everyone it touched. 2 days after the urine biscuit fiasco, the niece of William Griggs, the family doctor of the Parrises, was walking into town on an errand for her uncle when she felt she was being followed. This young girl's name was Elizabeth Hubbard, and as she sped up her pace to get home, she saw a wolf, but it wasn't your typical wolf. This animal was a witch's familiar. It was large and dark with glowing eyes, and as she ran the last few miles home, she realized who the familiar answered to, who the familiar belonged to. Elizabeth told her uncle that the dark servant of Sarah Good, the unfriendly beggar, had been following her and watching her. Along with Sarah Good, Elizabeth accused another woman in town of harassing her, a woman named Sarah Osborne. So the Putnams were the family responsible for bringing Samuel Parris to Salem Village, and Thomas Putnam Jr. was good friends with Samuel, so he'd gone over to the Parris home to see the condition of the girls himself. Bewildered and terrified, he went back home and told his wife and 12-year-old daughter Annie about what he had seen, how the girls were acting, and what they were claiming. Within no time, of course, Annie herself had fallen ill with the same symptoms. It's crazy. It's almost like she was influenced by her father's tale that he brought home with him. It's almost like she just copied what she heard him say. But Thomas Putnam knew what had really happened. The devil had followed him home. The following weekend, a huge storm hit Salem. The wind and the rain slapped the window panes of the homes as if Satan himself was trying to get in. When it had passed the following Monday morning, Thomas and 3 other men traveled to Salem town to meet with the local magistrates, Jonathan Hawthorne and Jonathan Corwin. Now, the Hawthorne family has been an important one in Salem since its founding. Jonathan's father, William, was amongst the earliest settlers of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Jonathan had married the granddaughter of one of the initial settlers as well, and he'd gone on to build a profitable shipping empire. Due to his pedigree and wealth, he was a very powerful man in Salem with a lot of influence. Nathaniel Hawthorne, the famous writer who wrote The Scarlet Letter, is actually a descendant of Jonathan Hawthorne. And if you've ever been to Salem and you've seen the House of Seven Gables, which is right by where I stayed when we went to Salem a couple of months ago, it's a gorgeous house, but that was their home. So the Hawthorne family, from the get-go, from the beginning of the existence of Salem, had been, very powerful, very influential, and very well respected. Jonathan Corwin was also a descendant from a founding family of Salem, and he'd also become successful and wealthy after taking over his father's shipping business. Now, when Thomas Putnam told Hawthorne and Corwin what was going on in the village, they sprang right into action. They felt they needed to stop the spread of the evil before it made its way to the town from the village. But how would they go about doing that? The lines of the law, when it came to witchcraft at this time, were very blurry. For a long time, the rules of the law were very clear-cut, as they would follow the Massachusetts Bay Charter, which had been set up over 60 years prior to 1692. The charter had been issued by King Charles over in England, but in 1684, England annulled the charter due to what they called repeated violations of its terms. Now, these violations included the colonists, the American colonists, trading with countries other than England, as well as creating a number of laws that did not align with England laws. So when these 3 women were arrested for witchcraft, the colonists no longer had a list of do's and don'ts. So the people followed the men who they thought they could trust, men who had long-standing generational ties to Salem, whose ancestors had built the city into what it was, and who should have known what they were doing, men like Jonathan Hawthorne and Jonathan Corwin. Now, witchcraft was a capital crime, punishable by death. Under the revoked charter, you would have to provide good, solid evidence when accusing someone of being a witch, and you would also have to post bond to support your claims. If it turned out that an accuser could not support their claims, they'd have to forfeit this money, which obviously acted as a deterrent when casually accusing others of serious crimes. So if you were going to accuse somebody of witchcraft, you'd have to give a bunch of money, and then you'd have to provide proof. And if your proof wasn't sufficient to prove that the person was a witch, then you would forfeit the money. It would just be taken from you. So there weren't a ton of people just randomly accusing others of being witches. But when Thomas Putnam and his buddies went to the magistrates and started pointing fingers and naming names of people they thought were witches, they didn't pay any bond, they didn't provide any evidence, but arrests and warrants were issued anyways. Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba were all placed under arrest and charged with witchcraft. They were thrown into prison, and their examinations were scheduled to happen quickly and publicly at the New Salem Meeting House. The whole population of Salem would gather to watch, and as the trials went on and gained publicity, people even traveled from outside of Salem to spectate and bring news of the witches back to their own towns. Although many of the men who presided over these trials were educated, they all bought into this whole devil and witchcraft thing anyways, and it became a race to see who could and who would accuse who first. And if you had something to gain from accusing another person of witchcraft, such as, I don't know, maybe evening the score between two families, even better. Annie Putnam went on an accusation spree. Now remember, the Putnams don't like the Porters. The Putnams are also the ones who had brought Samuel Parris to the town to begin with. First, Annie Putnam accused the 5-year-old daughter of Sarah Good, and Sarah Good was already in jail at this time. Annie claimed she'd seen little Dorothy Good holding the book of the devil out to her and demanding that she sign this. Annie Putnam is an asshole. A week after this, Annie pointed the finger at Elizabeth Proctor, a pregnant mother of 5. Elizabeth and her husband John ran a tavern in the village. They were also part of the wealthy Proctor family, arch enemies of the Putnams. Elizabeth and John were highly respected members of the community, and Elizabeth was known to be very smart and kind to all people. But there were a few dark marks on her record. Her grandmother had been accused of being a witch 3 decades before, so there was already whispers that the dark magic was in her blood. And on top of that, she was known for allowing Native Americans to come into the tavern and drink, which caused alarm amongst her neighbors, since Native Americans at that time were considered to be godless savages, agents of the devil, and less than. Elizabeth and John Proctor also had a long-standing rivalry with another man who would soon come under the microscope of the magistrates, Giles Corey. Giles hated that the Proctors allowed Native Americans in the tavern, and he had actually brought them to court because of it at one time. He even set fire to their house when he lost that case. After the Proctors won that case, it seemed like everyone had gone on with their lives, but behind closed doors, there were still whispers that something was not right with Elizabeth Proctor. When the Proctors' servant girl, Mary Warren, heard about the allegations against Elizabeth, she piled on. Now, Mary was 18 years old, an orphan who the Proctors had taken in, but she was constantly telling people that the Proctors mistreated her, and seeing them under the spotlight was her chance to get even. On March 12th, Mary testified that the specter of John Proctor had floated around the house before settling in her lap. Now, John Proctor was a no-nonsense kind of person, and he was having none of this. He'd heard about the other girls and their fits and their stories, and he thought it was all ridiculous. He believed that they were lying, and he had no problem discussing that he thought these girls were lying with his wife behind closed doors, with, customers of his tavern right out in public. He was just, a logical kind of person who felt he could voice that, this whole thing was ridiculous. So when his own servant girl began making claims that could potentially get him and his wife thrown into jail, he took a very expedient approach, and he told her that if she didn't stop with her foolishness, he would beat it out of her. John even told a customer at the tavern that he would rather pay money than see his servant become involved with the ludicrous witch trials, and the other girls involved should be whipped and hanged for lying, an attitude that we will see soon comes back to bite him. Mary did stop for a while under the threat of physical violence, but she came back with a vengeance, accusing Martha Corey, wife of Giles Corey. Now, what was it about Martha and Giles Corey that made them so unpopular in the village? Well, there was quite a lot, actually. Giles had taken advantage of a church loophole that allowed him to gain membership at the Halfway Covenant Salem Town Church, but then attend the Salem Village Church, which was not a Halfway Covenant church. Giles was also a man who was known to have a violent temper, and he was generally just very grumpy and unsociable. Giles had been born in England in 1611. He immigrated to Salem as a young man and moved to Salem Farms in 1659, just outside of Salem Village. There he owned a very big, large, good plot of land, and he became a prosperous farmer, but overall, he was, like I said, a very grumpy, unsociable type of person who was known to have a violent temper. He used vile language and he got into arguments with his neighbors all the time, during which he would call them damn devilish rogues. He was also accused by his neighbors of stealing things such as tools from their property. And in 1675, Giles beat a young farmhand named Jacob Goodall to death after he stole some apples from Giles' brother. The coroner ruled Jacob Goodall's death as a murder, and Corey was ordered to pay a fine, but no one ever really looked at him the same again. And we already talked about the fact that he tried to burn down the house of his neighbors, John and Elizabeth Proctor. He was no one's favorite person. Let's just say that. His own wife, Martha Corey, wasn't even a huge fan of Giles, and the people of Salem Village weren't huge fans of either of the Coreys. Martha was generally seen as a social climber with a checkered past. She'd given birth to a son out of wedlock who was allegedly of mixed race. Giles was her second husband. Her first husband, Henry Rich, had died, leaving her free to marry Giles in 1690. Now, when she married him, Giles was a wealthy man who was already in his 80s, so many people whispered that she'd married him because he had one foot in the grave and she wouldn't have to wait long to be in control of his money and land. But she wasn't really an outsider like the others who had already been accused of witchcraft. She was a full-fledged member of the church, no halfway covenant for her, and she was incredibly pious and God-fearing. Her husband Giles had been going to the trials of the women accused, interested in observing the examinations, knowing his wife had a bad reputation and she might possibly be accused of witchcraft. Neighbors actually witnessed him getting on his horse ready to go to the meeting house one day, and Martha ran out to stop him. She unbuckled his saddle and threw it into the dirt to try and change his mind and keep him from going to the trials, feeling like they shouldn't get involved in the proceedings. And, he swore at her and he was like, "Leave me alone, woman. Go make my dinner. I'm going to go to the meeting house if I want. I am a man." It was also very well known that Samuel Parris detested the Coreys. He was 100% against the halfway covenant, yet every Sunday he had to stand at the front of the church and look out to see Giles Corey, a man who had murdered someone, who swore at people, who set fire to people's houses, sitting there enjoying the same religious freedoms as everyone else. And another woman who would later be accused, Rebecca Nurse, she was the wife of one of the men trying to make Samuel's life as difficult as possible, hoping that he would leave town. They were trying to chase him out of town. So it's really not hard to see that this man of faith, Samuel Parris, had more to do with the witch trials than just being the father and the uncle of the first two accusers. And a very naive Martha Corey, who had avoided the other trials and kept to herself, was also vocal about her disbelief that there was witches flying around Salem using little girls as marionettes. Word of her low opinion of them got back to Abigail Williams and Betty Parris, and the next Sunday during church services, where a sermon was being given by guest minister Deodat Lawson, they began their theatrics for all to see. The afflicted girls all began in chorus to moan and sway before throwing themselves down on the ground, writhing in pain. Abigail Williams pointed to the air, and she screamed that she could see Martha Corey flying around the room. Martha, who was sitting in church that day, was shocked and tried to defend herself, but she was arrested the next day. Martha still felt that she would have a fair trial, and she never wavered from her innocence. Now, during her examination, which her alleged victims were present for, Martha asked the judges to not believe these hysterical children and plainly told them, "There's no actual evidence for you to point to where you can say I participated in any witchcraft." Now, as she was speaking to the judges, the girls began mimicking her movements, claiming that she was forcing them to do so. A few other possessed girls had joined their ranks by now, including Mercy Lewis and Ann Putnam. Mercy said she could see a man whispering in Martha's ear, telling her what to say, to which John Hawthorne, one of the judges, asked her, "Is this man Satan?" Ann Putnam cried out that she could see a yellow bird sucking on Martha's hand because birds have beaks and it's really easy for them to suck on things, right? But okay. Now, this yellow bird was supposedly Martha Corey's familiar. The girls also said Martha Corey had been tormenting them for weeks, trying to force them to sign the devil's book, to which Martha replied, "What book? Where should I have seen a book? I showed these girls none, nor brought none." The judges were offended by Martha's suggestion that their version of justice was ridiculous and unfair. So if you remember, there's no real guidelines here. The charter's been revoked. The charter had outlined everything you would do in the situation of someone being accused of witchcraft, and they didn't have that anymore. So the colony had created the Court of Oyer and Terminer to handle these witchcraft trials. With this court, there was no such thing as innocent until proven guilty, and a person could be put to death with any of the three kinds of evidence accepted by the court. 1, a confession, which many of the accused actually gave, thinking that it would redeem them in the eyes of the judges. Tituba, the servant of Samuel Parris, initially denied everything, but when that did not satisfy the court, she gave them what they wanted. She told them that the devil had in fact come to her and demanded that she serve him. She painted a colorful and detailed picture of a tall white man who had traveled to Boston with his accomplices and ordered her to hurt the girls or face death. He had been followed by many strange animals, a hog, a big black dog, a red cat, a yellow bird, and a hairy creature that looked like an animal but walked on 2 legs. While John Hawthorne fed her leading questions, she pivoted to answer them in a way she felt he would be satisfied with. He asked her about the devil's book, and she described it in detail, even giving names of those in the village who had already signed themselves into the servitude of the devil. She herself had signed it in blood. At one point, she began shrieking that she could no longer see. The devil was angry with her for revealing his secrets, and he had tried to incapacitate her by blinding her. Tituba's colorful testimony did nothing but convince the court of Oyer and Terminer, as well as the townspeople observing, that there were in fact witches among them, and they were all in danger of falling victim to their evils. The second kind of evidence that was accepted was the testimony of at least 2 eyewitnesses to acts of witchcraft. And as the trials went on, the numbers of the accusers grew, ensuring there would never be any issue of having less than 2 girls pointing the finger at any one person. And thirdly, they allowed spectral evidence into the court, meaning whatever these girls saw while they were being attacked by invisible forces was taken as fact, even if no one else could see this happening. According to historical accounts of these trials, spectral evidence was never used alone to condemn an accused witch, but it didn't need to be, since there was plenty of hysterical young girls running around, ducking the blows of invisible people who were tormenting them. The court also allowed in causal evidence, which meant the past behaviors of an accused would be brought in as evidence. Witch marks were always a guaranteed way to seal the deal, with the accused women being stripped down and searched for the bites of their familiars. It was an actual legitimate shit show. Abigail Williams claimed she'd seen a group of witches holding a devil's dinner in Salem under the cover of dark. But this was not a small group. She wanted everybody to know it wasn't just like a couple witches. There were at least 40 townspeople present who were all witches. The court looked at the 9 people they had in custody and realized they needed to get to work and find the rest. Deodat Lawson had been a minister in Salem Village before Samuel Parris had arrived, but he'd left after his wife and daughter died. He came back when the witchcraft mania started, and he wrote a 10-page pamphlet about the whole bizarre affair, but he didn't write about how he was surprised, how quickly people could just sort of jump on a bandwagon. He wrote about how terrifying it was that a town of good, God-fearing people could be infiltrated by the servants of the devil. His little pamphlet spread the word far past Salem, all the way to Boston and to the governor of the Massachusetts colony. Simon Broadstreet caught wind of what was happening in Salem, and he sent his deputy governor, Thomas Danforth, and 4 other men to the village to observe and report back. The court proceedings were moved from Salem Village to Salem Town and the larger meeting house to accommodate the growing number of the accused and to ensure that they made a good impression on their important visitors. The presence of the governor's representatives fueled the fire for Hawthorne and Corwin, who felt they had to put on a good show for their guests to illustrate just how bad and devilish things really were in Salem. When Danforth and his crew arrived, the stories and the antics got more dramatic. During that first day in Salem Town, John Indian had stood up and accused Elizabeth Proctor of trying to force him to sign the devil's book. Her husband John also stood and told John Indian that he was going to beat the devil out of him. Elizabeth calmly looked at John Indian and told him that he wasn't just lying to the people present, he was lying to God, which was much worse. As she was speaking, the young girls, who made up the main accusers, began yelling that her husband, John Proctor, was attacking them. He was dragged to the front and told to explain, to which he responded, there was nothing to explain. He hadn't done a thing. Now, to prove he wasn't touched by the devil, John Proctor was made to recite the Lord's Prayer, since it was believed no agent of the devil could do so. He said it all, but those in attendance gasped when he said, "Hallowed be thy name," because it was supposed to be hallowed, and they thought he had said hollowed. Annie Putnam and her mother, Ann Putnam, who was not a young girl, but a grown-ass woman of 30 years old, started yelling that Elizabeth Proctor's spirit was trying to silence them. They started flailing their arms around to fight off the aggressive spirit. It was complete and utter chaos, and both John and Elizabeth Proctor were promptly arrested. Mary Warren, their servant girl, had to go back home and tell the children that their parents were not coming home. But things wouldn't end well for Mary either. Although her original affliction had passed, remember, she had originally said that John Proctor, her employer, was flying around the room and trying to sit in her lap. But then John Proctor said he was going to beat the devil out of her, so she got over that really quick. And then after that, she taped a letter to the church door on April 2nd asking the community to pray to God and thank him for saving her from the devil. Well, this was not accepted by the people of Salem. Samuel Parris was curious as to how she had been cured so quickly when none of the other girls had been so lucky. And during a sermon, he posed this question to the community, wondering out loud if her sudden cure might be the work of the devil, not God. Just so you know, I fully and wholeheartedly blame Samuel Parris for every single person that was hanged in Salem as a witch. I think he was really a piece of shit. So Mary knew the community suspected her because, gossip. That's all they had to do back then. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have Netflix. They just gossiped about each other. So during the trial of her employers, the Proctors, she testified against them, saying they'd made her sign the devil's book to try to save herself. But it didn't matter because her sudden recovery had made the other girls look so bad. So they turned on Mary during the same trial. Annie Putnam and Abigail Williams told the court that Mary Warren had been sitting right next to Elizabeth Proctor, and both of their spirits had appeared to them, urging them to sign the devil's book. Right after this, John Putnam, Ann Putnam's husband and Annie Putnam's father, accused Mary Warren of bewitching the girls, which she denied, but when the girls were asked, they said Mary had hurt them, and then they fell to the floor to illustrate that she was doing it again. Mary panicked, and so she confessed to having touched the devil's book, but she claimed the Proctors had forced her. After this, she began aggressively accusing other people, as many as possible, and she actually testified at multiple trials, including Giles Corey, who would be arrested soon after his wife, Martha. Now, Mary Warren had actually been overheard telling John Hawthorne and John Corwin that she had lied about everything and retracting her accusations. Many of those in prison had been put there based on her testimony, and after hearing that she had admitted to lying, they wrote a joint statement trying to get released, but they never were because it was ignored because no one cared. No one was safe in Salem, except maybe for the Putnams and the Parrises who started all of this nonsense. And the harsh and uncomfortable truth of the whole thing is that everyone who was accused and inevitably killed as a result of these girls' accusations, had done nothing wrong besides being an enemy of the Putnams and Samuel Parris, being an outsider or having something that someone else wanted. A good example of this is Rebecca Nurse, who was 71 years old and a pillar of the community. A newspaper at that time described her as being saint-like, the perfect example of a good Puritan woman. But she'd stood up against the Putnams one too many times, battling with them in court over land. Anne Putnam and her daughter Annie Putnam accused Rebecca of witchcraft, and the townspeople shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Rebecca Nurse was a full member of the church. No one was more pious than Rebecca Nurse. Samuel Parris sensed their unease, and so he turned to the Bible to explain this unfortunate turn of events. He told the congregation that a witch could be anyone. Even those who had been closest to Jesus had been swayed by the dark side and had turned on Jesus. If it could happen to Jesus, any one of them could be tricked by a wolf in sheep's clothing. Now, Martha and Giles Corey had not been married long when they were tossed in jail together to await their trials. Don't worry, these grown men running the trials weren't just taking the word of some little girls. They investigated themselves. Edward Putnam and Ezekiel Cheever had gone to the house of Annie Putnam to ask her what Martha's spirit had been wearing when she'd been attacked by the spirit. And then they were going to go to Martha's house to see if she was wearing the same clothes. Annie said that she'd been temporarily blinded during the attack, so she couldn't describe the clothes that Martha was wearing. But the two men decided to pay the Coreys a visit anyways, and when they arrived, Martha told them plainly and bluntly, I know why you're here. I know you're here to see if I'm wearing the same clothes as my spirit was wearing when it attacked Annie Putnam. Now, apparently, these men, they didn't like how smug Martha was being, especially when she told them, let me guess, you're here to see if I'm wearing the same clothes as the spirit that attacked little Annie. The men were shocked, and they were like, she must be a witch because she read our minds. In reality, Martha thought the whole thing was ludicrous, and the rumor mill had started churning as soon as Edward and Ezekiel had left the Putnam home, and by the time they had arrived to the Coreys, Martha had already heard about what their mission was from her own husband, who was drinking at a bar and heard about it. So this was a week before her arrest, and everyone in town stared in shock as she showed up to church the following Sunday as if nothing was wrong. And that was the morning the accusations would be officially launched at her, because they were like, you've been attacking all of these girls and now you have the balls to come to church? How dare you? Now, during Martha's trial on March 24th, her husband, Giles Corey, testified against her. He told the court that one night he and his wife were sitting by the fire when he decided to go to bed so he could pray. But when he tried to pray, he couldn't get the words out. She was stopping him from saying the prayer. He also claimed that he'd watched his wife kneel down in prayer before, but she never spoke those prayers out loud. Now, whether or not Giles Corey actually believed the accusations against his wife, or if he was just trying to get suspicion off himself, we'll never really know. But if he was trying to avoid being accused, it didn't work. Just a few weeks later, he himself was arrested for witchcraft, and during his examination, he refused to repeat his incriminating testimony against his wife. I guess maybe he had second thoughts, maybe he felt bad, probably knew she wasn't really a witch. Now, during Martha's actual trial, which took place in September, several witnesses spoke out against her, including Abigail Williams, Samuel Parris, Edward Putnam, and Mercy Lewis. She was found guilty on September 8th and sentenced to death. 3 days later, she was excommunicated from the church, but her husband, Giles, would be killed first. Giles had refused to enter a plea of innocent or guilty, which meant the court of Oyer and Terminer could not legally put him on trial. He did what the English called standing mute. So they were like, how do you plead? And he just wouldn't say anything. They sent him back to jail so they could figure out what to do with him. Obviously, like I said, the charter had been revoked, so they were just making up things as they went along. And so they began to research, what would you normally do when somebody's standing mute? And during their research, the court found out that per English law, they could apply strong and harsh punishment in order to compel Giles to enter a plea. On September 18th, Giles was visited by Samuel Parris in jail, who excommunicated him from the church. He was probably so pumped and excited and satisfied when he was able to excommunicate Giles from the church. And Samuel tried to get Giles to enter a guilty plea, or any plea at all, but Giles Corey said nothing. On Monday, September 19th, Giles was led out of the Salem jail to an open field across the street. It was a crisp, clear New England fall day, and the townspeople gathered around to watch what was about to happen. Giles Corey was laid face up on the ground, and flat boards were placed across his body. One by one, heavy stones were placed on the boards, while the sheriff at that time, George Corwin, stood by, directing the other men on where to put the stones and how often to apply more weight. George Corwin was the brother-in-law of Jonathan Corwin, who was a judge on the Oyer and Terminus Court, and one of the men who had pushed the hysteria of witchcraft in Salem as far as it could possibly go. Now, the idea was to put Giles in enough pain to force him to enter a plea. Every time a stone was placed on top of him, Sheriff Corwin would demand that Giles enter a plea. But Giles would say nothing. At some point, it became just torture, plain and simple, with no productive outcome that could possibly be expected. The damage on Giles's body and internal organs would have been irreversible. Robert Califf, a Salem merchant who was present, wrote about this experience later, and according to his reports, after hundreds and hundreds of pounds of weight were placed on the old man, and a plea was demanded, Giles Corey simply said, "More weight." Califf also wrote that at one point, Giles's tongue was being pressed out of his mouth from the pressure, and Sheriff Corwin pushed it back in with his cane before calling for more stones to be placed. Giles Corey wasn't just being a stubborn old man. He'd seen enough of these trials to know that a plea of not guilty would have still ended with him being charged as a witch. And at that point, all of his money and property would have been confiscated by the town and redistributed to the Putnam family, who had had their eyes on his property for quite a while. If he never entered a plea, he would be tortured to death, but at least his children would be allowed to keep the family home and the land. 3 days after this, Martha Corey was driven by cart to the execution site at Proctor's Lodge, along with 7 other convicted witches. As the rope was being placed around her neck, Martha Corey prayed out loud one last time. Now it is said that Giles Corey used his last bit of energy to utter these words right before he died. He slid his eyes over to Sheriff Corwin and said, "Damn you, I curse you and Salem," before giving in to the weight on top of him. In fact, after the hangings of Martha Corey and 8 others, the town noticed that they had been suffering many misfortunes, including natural disasters, which were wiping out their crops. They began to feel guilty for what had happened and wondered if they'd angered God by killing innocent people. On January 15th, 1697, Salem held a day of prayer and fasting, known as the Day of Official Humiliation. But if you ask a lot of the locals, Giles Corey placed a curse on them all that day he died. That did not end after one day of prayer and a few skipped meals. In 1978, the sheriff of Salem, who was named Robert Cahill, suffered from a heart attack and stroke, and he was diagnosed with a rare blood disease. Now, he remembered the folklore of the sheriff's curse, and he took it upon himself to do some digging. What he discovered shocked him. The sheriff who had been responsible for the torture and death of Giles Corey, George Corwin, had died 4 years later at the age of 30 from a heart attack. Cahill discovered that as far back as the records went, every sheriff since Corwin had suffered from either heart or blood problems. Many of them had died at a young age, and Cahill himself was forced to retire when the doctors could not put their finger on what had caused his affliction. It's thought that the curse was broken when the sheriff's office moved from Salem to Middlesex in 1991, but there are still many people who believe it has lingered. Giles Corey didn't just curse the sheriff, he cursed the entire town, and local legend says that Giles Corey can be seen at his gravesite right before a tragedy. The night before the Great Fire of 1914 ravaged Salem, reports were made of the apparition of a man standing in the Howard Street Cemetery, pointing his finger in the direction of Gallows Hill at Proctor's Ledge, where his wife and 18 others had been hanged as witches, and where the fire would break out the next day. It's also said that if you see him, you or someone you love could be in danger of dying. While in Salem, I went to the Howard Street Cemetery, which is not actually the burial place of Giles Corey, but in 1692, it was an open field, the very same field where Giles was brought to be crushed to death. I didn't see any apparitions, but if I had, I guess I wouldn't have blamed him for being angry so many years later and still trying to get his revenge from the grave. I mean, was Giles Corey the best person in the world? No, he wasn't. He was clearly racist. He was not very nice to anyone. He killed Jacob Goodall just for stealing apples. He was just kind of a dick. But what happened to him was not right. What happened to all of those people was not right. Just because some little girls were being used as tools by adults. And I don't think that these little girls were forced to do it by Samuel Parris or, the Putnams. I think that they were just bored and they were like, oh, let's play with, some fortune telling. And then they got scared and then they said, oh, this is fun. Let's keep it going. I mean, literally, these people, the Puritans, were so restricted from anything that was going to bring them joy or happiness or new experiences. It was a very boring life to live. So I'd imagine they were just bored. And then they started playing these games. And then the adults, who should have been the adults, and said, all right, enough of this, you're acting ridiculous. They took these little girls and what they were doing and used them as weapons and tools against their enemies. And that's really what happened in the Salem witch trials, in my opinion. That is going to be it for today's video. Let me know if you've ever been to Salem. Let me know if you've ever been to the Howard Street Cemetery or to Proctor's Ledge. I did go with my family a couple of months ago, and it was a very enjoyable sort of trip because there weren't a lot of people there. It wasn't very touristy. Nothing was open, but I could still go to the landmarks that I wanted to go to. Just a very beautiful city, a very cool city. I love it. So if any of you live in Salem or near Salem, I love your town. It's so cool. One of my favorite places in the whole world. But let me know if you've ever been there. Let me know if you've ever seen anything while you were there. Let me know what you think about the Salem witch trials. Let me know what you think about the sheriff's curse. Do you think it could be a thing? Do you think it's possible? I mean, that's a very big coincidence that every sheriff of Salem, after Corwin, suffered from some sort of heart or blood disease. Could it be possible? So make sure to let me know what you think in the comments. Make sure to check out the Harloween merch. There's a new design this season for 2020. My old designs from last year are still in there because I love them and they're timeless, but there's a new one, and I will put a picture of it right here or here someplace so you can see it. But check out the merch in the description box. Make sure you check out Truman's in the description box to get your house clean without toxins, without chemicals. Like the video if you liked it, share it if you think it's worth sharing. Make sure you're subscribed so you can be here for the rest of Halloween. I cannot wait to share this Halloween season with you. Stay kind, stay beautiful, and stay spooky, and I will see you very, very soon. Bye. Straight down.